Patch it together. Got to make it work. So Peter, I deleted the other post on Twitter and stuff. So thank you for being here, and maybe a quick introduction, then we'll get rolling.
Hi, John. Really good to be here as well. I'm a great fan of your show. I spent a lot of time listening to it during the 2020 lockdown days in the UK, and it's really good that I'm having the chance to be on here chatting with you today. In terms of my background, I've spent about 10 years living in China prior to doing what I do today. And living over there, I worked in trade and investment and for the British Embassy for a time and for a company. But during 2017, I started to learn more about Bitcoin, which was going on, which a lot of stuff was going on within China during that time. And I gradually made a move to a new career path. And I'm now working as a consultant in the Bitcoin space for three businesses, the Free Private Cities Foundation, Incrementum, and Safety Moose's online education platform, safety.com.
Awesome. What led you to China? What's your China origin story before we get into the Bitcoin origin story?
So when I was at uni, I studied physics with philosophy, which is not exactly a vocational set of majors to do. So afterwards, I just thought I wanted to do something a bit different, travel overseas, do a kind of post-university gap year. And I didn't really think a lot about it. I just thought China seemed like an interesting place. There were lots of programs for teaching English over there. So I applied for one with the British Council, which is a British cultural relations body, and succeeded in getting the place. And then from then on, I became more and more interested in China as I started learning the language, as I started finding out more about the history, as I started to get a sense of the energy that there is on the ground over there and the pace of development. And I decided to stay, originally thinking it would be for like 1, 2, 3 years, but 1 year turned to 2, and then I was there for 10 years in the end. And it was a real adventure. And similar to you in a way, the sort of length of time and the moving around within the country as well.
So where were you? Where were the cities that you lived in China?
So I started down in Guangzhou, and I lived there for 1 year. And then that wasn't quite what I had expected China to be like. I expected it to be a bit more, because Guangzhou is a huge city, something like 12 million people, something like that. And I expected China to be a bit more rural, idyllic. And so I decided that for my next year, I would try and find something that was in a more rural part. And I thought Sichuan, that seems really rural. I'd heard some people that have moved there and lived there. So I ended up, without even visiting the place, going to this, what I would call a middle-sized Chinese city called Nanchong, expecting that to be the kind of idyllic rural China that I was expecting. And of course, that also turned out to be quite a large city, not on the scale of Guangzhou, but I had a really great time there. That was like my formative time in China. And then I ended up with the embassy in Beijing, working there for a time. I spent 2 years in Wuhan, and then I moved back to Beijing, and that's where I spent the final 4 years of my time.
Right. So no stint in Shanghai.
No, although I did visit, and Shanghai is another really great place, another really nice fusion of East and West, and a lot of old and new bits combined, but never lived there.
Yeah, Shanghai is definitely my favorite area, and I guess dissimilar to you, I went there for the mega city. You know, I thought Shanghai was New York at the turn of the century. You know, early 1900s, center of the world, and wanted to be a part of the action. I mean, as you referenced, the energy there is unbelievable, and the development, and especially, I'm sure it's still very much like that, but I think the period where we were there, like the 2010 to 2020 era, was probably I don't know if the most robust, but I mean, man, I don't know if that energy will ever be replicated again on that scale, because it was just breakneck pace and so much ambition and so much so much building, and everybody is just kind of on fire with that energy. And you go out on the street and it's just altogether different. I'd get a culture shock when I would go home to Canada because everything was so subdued and people were so comfortable and all that kind of stuff. And then when I would, after the Christmas break, I'd go back to China, and it would take me a week or two to get like back up to that speed, because it's so dramatic. What's your take on, what was your take on your time in China? What's your current take on China economically, politically? What's your view on all that?
Well, I went to China in part it was random, as I say. Like, I saw that there was this opportunity to study, to teach English over there. But I think the thing that cemented me in that path and like choosing to apply for that, there was also a program in Japan that I did consider applying for. But since studying history at school, I was just really intrigued by communism, like communist political systems, not because I was sympathetic to the ideas, but because I found it really interesting that there'd been this guy, this kind of philosopher guy, Karl Marx, and he had inspired people to create this political system. And then it had ended up taking over what at its peak was about a third of the world's population. And it was almost like a religion in its ideology, its cult of the personality. And the fact that China was one of the 5 remaining nominally communist countries in the world was quite interesting to me. And when I went there, I expected it to be a bit less developed on the one hand, and also a bit more communist in the sense of being more controlled, more state-run, more regulated, more homogenous. And my whole 10 years in China taught me that that really isn't the case. In many ways, China is a much more capitalist country than Britain, where I grew up, even though the narrative is that there's this kind of battle between free market capitalism in the West and state socialism in the East. I came to realize that that wasn't the case. And there are lots of things about China that I came to really admire. And there were lots of things that frustrated me about living there. And I think overall, there are certain things about China that I'm really optimistic about, but there are other things that I would really like to see change. And it is upsetting to me what's happened in the last couple of years, in that places all around the world, but including China, have become more restricted and less energetic. As you say, like when we were there, maybe that was a bit of a golden era in terms of the dynamism that was going on. But now everywhere in this kind of COVID era has become more restricted, and I can't even go back to China now, unfortunately.
Why is that?
So a lot has changed, because if you want to go back to China, you've got to spend 2 weeks in a quarantine hotel. You have to have a specific reason to go to get a visa. Yeah. And it's very sad. Like, I left in January 2020 with about 2 days notice. And luckily I had been like progressing towards a very minimalist lifestyle in the months prior to that. So I was able to respond quickly to what was happening and like take all my stuff with me. But it wasn't something that I wanted to do. I didn't really want to leave like that. And I wasn't able to say goodbyes to people. So it was a bit tough. And I do miss a lot of people that are over there. And I do hope I can get back sooner rather than later.
So that's get back to live and work is something you'd like to do?
I think things have moved on a lot for me personally since that time.
Yeah.
And to live and work, my situation at the moment is that I'm totally remote. This is something that I've tried to engineer with my life, because I realized that it would bring a lot of advantages in terms of what I was able to experience. It would provide the opportunity to be based in one place and be more stable if that was a desired option, but it would also provide the opportunity to move around more. And I would really like to go back to China to see all the people that I had to say goodbye to or didn't get to say goodbye to. But I would also like to spend a bit of a stint traveling around there. but I probably don't see myself living there again unless something radical changes.
Yeah. I used to come back, as I said, for Christmas vacation, and people would find it so odd or interesting that I lived in China, right? Because as you say, there's the perception of China being this like totalitarian communist dictatorship regime. And then the reality on the ground is that, especially as a foreigner, but even as your average Chinese citizen, like if you just don't involve yourself in political life, first of all, there's no reason to. I mean, the primary political issue in the world typically is an economic one, right? Do people have more opportunity than they previously had? And if the answer is yes, and especially if the answer is yes on the scale it was true in China, people don't really care about politics. Am I safe? Do I have opportunity? Cool. I'm going to go pursue that, and I don't want to be involved in politics. And that's the case for most people in China. And like, I would come back and echo the same sentiment that you just did. And I know like China has these overhanging, really serious like human rights abuse issues, and there are obviously many reasons to be highly critical of the Chinese Communist Party and the regime and that kind of stuff. But as far as my experience on the ground living in China as an expat, I would always come back and say like, China is way freer than things are here in Canada. Like the government and imposition and regulations are far lesser a part of my life than they typically are in Canada. And of course the opportunity, there's lots of opportunity and lots of activity. And the modern, things were incredibly modern, to your earlier point. I mean, like a city like Shanghai and Beijing, probably to a lesser extent, but still to a great extent and more all the time, is like the most modern place in the world, probably. And, so it was very interesting to come back and have to kind of explain that to people every time. You mentioned that you've engineered your life to be adaptable. And I think, especially in light of COVID, a lot of people see the value in that. And in the Bitcoin space, we are often now talking about, how to maneuver this landscape, and maybe you're hunkering down in red state US, or maybe you found a little pocket somewhere in the world. But if not, the name of the game seems to be to try to engineer an adaptable lifestyle so that you can move around like that. What's your take about, since leaving China and the COVID situation? I mean, what's your impression on all this? Why is this playing out? What's the approach that you're trying to take to maneuver this optimally, let's say?
So on a personal level, I've just always been really excited about the idea of being able to travel and experience different cultures. And I've tried to find ways that I can do that through the careers that I've pursued and how I've spent my free time and annual leave. So I've traveled a lot. And the thing I'd always felt when traveling is that there was always this nagging feeling at the back of my mind that this was like too short. I was having to cram everything into a specific window, like two bookends, one at the start of my annual leave, one at the end of my annual leave. And I feel like that's how I'd experienced most of my travel in the past. I hadn't been able to really take things slowly. I'd felt obliged to see all of the sites and pack stuff in. And then you've got the cost of it. You've got to pay for a flight at one end and the other end. And it just means that you don't really appreciate travel in the way that, for example, Rolf Potts describes in his book Vagabonding, where you move from place to place to place. So on a personal level, it's something that I'd wanted to do for a long time. And I've been thinking in 2019, I wasn't really happy in my job. And I was feeling like so much of it was remote. I was representing a company in Beijing and I did all these emails, but other than a few meetings in Beijing, I could have been anywhere. And I was thinking, well, is there a way that I can move to a new job where I'll be able to just work completely remotely? So that was kind of my thinking from mid 2019. And then when the coronavirus thing came along, this seemed like a good opportunity. Well, in my mind, this seemed like a good opportunity to actually make the change. Most people thought it was completely crazy because it wasn't it wasn't the case that like coronavirus happened and I lost my job. Like I had a secure job, but I just kind of saw this as like, things are changing. We're going to have to do a strategic rethink in the company. Do I want to be here, or do I want to actually try and pursue something different? And I decided to go in that other direction. And I took 6 months off to study economics and do some reading of some really long, good books that I'd wanted to get to for a long time, but didn't feel I ever had the time to with work commitments. And so I did make the change. I can come on to what I did in a moment, but what I feel about the general environment is that, firstly, through the lockdowns, people have realized that they can work remotely a lot more than they previously thought. And secondly, the lockdowns have really restricted people. And although I would say the majority, let's say, of people tend to support lockdowns, even though I'm really against lockdowns, the vast majority of people seem to support them. But there is this large and very significant minority of people who say locking people in their homes, stopping people from visiting their elderly relatives, stopping people from socializing, stopping people from participating in culture. Like, this is not okay. This is not something that we want to accept. And so I'm someone who's now thinking, I'm 32 years old, and I'm thinking, what's next for the next stage of my life? And unfortunately, I've seen that in the UK and in many other countries, people are willing to just shut society down. And more people, I think, are saying, well, if there are countries where they're not willing to do that, like I'm planning on going to Mexico in a couple of months, because I understand Mexico have not done these lockdowns. I know there's a lot of problems in Mexico and other areas, but at least I know that they're much less likely to lock down for the winter, when it's looking like all of Europe is heading in that direction, at least to some extent. So I feel as well that there is that significant minority of people who don't agree with the lockdown policies that are now thinking about ways that they can divorce themselves from that traditional work model of staying in one place and being beholden to whatever the kind of majoritarian decision is on how they can live their lives.
Yeah. I mean, the sovereign individual thesis playing out just perfectly, right? I mean, this is what they articulated in that book, and why it's almost spooky, but also at the same time, it's entirely rational. So when you left China early 2020, was this the beginning of the Austrian economics rabbit hole for you, or had you been dabbling prior to that? And I guess you can weave in the Bitcoin origin story in that as well.
Sure. Well, they're both very closely intertwined. When I moved to Beijing in 2017, or when I started a new job in Beijing in 2017, which was a trade and investment job, I was running business missions for UK companies to China. I moved to a new co-working space, and I ended up meeting some Bitcoiners in this co-working space. And I had no idea what this Bitcoin thing was. I'd vaguely heard about it from a Chinese lesson that I did back in 2015, where it was on the subject of Bitcoin, and I just learned a bit of vocab around it. But I hadn't dug in. I wasn't particularly interested in it or understand why it was significant. And I just thought things like finance, like they kind of facilitate people's transactions, but they're not really important. They probably have too big a role in the economy, but I didn't really have a particularly coherent view on, monetary economics. Mm-hmm. And it was through meeting these Bitcoiners that I started to get arguments in a more libertarian direction. There was a guy in particular called Neil Woodfine, who I ended up talking to a lot and having some debates with. And he would recommend that these books that I go and read, and these arguments that I go and study. And very quickly in 2017, I kind of got it, because I'd been working in the government previously, and I'd seen firsthand what all of the mainstream economic justifications are for spending public money. And it's all about developing business cases with economic models and justifications for how we might shift GDP growth in this province if we are to like undertake an intervention that would shift Chinese policy by 2%, 3% in this particular area. Like I was already very skeptical of those kind of arguments. And then when I got exposed to the libertarian Austrian economics type arguments, it was like the penny dropped. And I realized that actually this was a coherent way of understanding economics. And it just provided huge explanatory power. So I ended up like getting some Bitcoin in like mid 2017. And just as it was kind of heading to that really euphoric kind of period. And so all this stuff was happening to me at the same time. Like I was getting into Bitcoin and buying Bitcoin. I was reading, you know, Murray Rothbard and Ludwig von Mises in my spare time outside work. And it kind of felt a bit odd because it was almost like the stuff I was reading about monetary history. So one of the very early books I read is Rothbard's What Has Government Done to Our Money? And reading that and then seeing the Bitcoin price soar towards 20,000 from about 4,000 or 5,000 felt like a bit like a vindication of what I was reading. So that's how it started. I ended up going very deep with the Austrian economics, reading a lot of authors. And I decided earlier this year that I was going to make that the focus of a new career.
Okay. How's that been going? how have you translated that, you know, sparked new interest in Austrian economics and Bitcoin? I mean, yeah, how have you navigated those waters? Because I mean, I'll put a little bit more meat on this question. I think a lot of people get exposure to Bitcoin and then they get exposure to these ideas in Austrian economics, whether or not they consult the actual literature or not, right? I think, and I'm probably an example of that. I have not consulted a lot of the Austrian economics literature, but I think understanding Bitcoin de facto gives you a lot of that. And then you just end up hearing how related these insights are and how the, you know, the kind of economic theory, if you want to call it that, is embedded in Bitcoin or it's articulated in the Austrian school. And so how has that, yeah, I mean, how have you taken that interest and tried to translate it into actual career? And what was the interim period like after the sell-off in 17? You're still in China 18, 19, things are in the doldrums. I mean, how did your thinking change or evolve during that time?
Yeah. By the way, that's really interesting. Like having listened to a lot of your podcasts in the past, it's interesting that you said you haven't kind of done that much reading of the like original text and stuff, because I think you articulate lots of the concepts very clearly, like much more clearly than I could. Like your recent one with Maxime Barnier, you were like coming up with some very succinct ways but describing Austrian economics concepts. And so I think that's something worth reflecting on, that we're like, as a community, I do feel like Bitcoiners have embedded these kinds of concepts really well. And I don't think you necessarily need to like spend loads of time reading the original text, although there are obvious benefits to it. But you know, what matters is the ideas and being able to think through the logic of what's being said. So yeah, it's just interesting to hear. So the question on like what the interim period was like was, yeah, I mean, 2018 came along, bear market began. I kind of bought everywhere from the 4 or 5 or whatever to 20K right at the peak. And then there were points where, you know, it does crash and you've not been through any kind of bear market before. And you start to think, what have I done? Like, what have I done? particularly John, because I'd been quite a big saver. I'd you know, been quite frugal in China because you can be frugal over there. And I found the work I was doing quite taxing. I didn't really enjoy it a lot. And so I really associated a lot of the difficult things I had to go through in the job with, the savings and stuff. And then I kind of came convinced that the Bitcoin was a better savings technology than fiat money. And so I took like a pretty big punt, like not immediately. I'd say I took a big punt on this thesis of Bitcoin working out, being correct. And I remember in particular, there was one time in 2018 when Bitcoin had like fallen really bad. And this was like when I think I acquired the majority of my Bitcoin. I remember like sitting there in a hotel room in London and making the transaction and then just thinking, okay, it's done. And thinking, have I just made a huge, huge mistake? It's psychologically very, very weird. But then 2020 happened, 2021 happened, and it seems like that was a very good decision right now. But you do have your moments where you think, is this actually the correct theory of money? Maybe the state theory of money has got its benefits in some ways. I do think it does have some benefits actually, but yeah, it was definitely a journey of like learning about Austrian economics and monetary theory and being into Bitcoin, and that whole thing added a very real skin in the game element to the whole process.
Yeah. What you said, the state theory of money has some benefits. Would you like to elaborate?
Yeah. The state theory of money states that money has value because of coercion, because states have the ability to force people to use it through taxation. And I think it is the case that states have the power of coercion. It doesn't mean that that is a moral and ethically justified thing, but it does mean that you can create demand for an asset by coercing people into using it.
Sure.
And I think that's what Bitcoin is up against. Now, do I think that Bitcoin is going to succeed in the long run over this like state issued monies? Yeah, absolutely. And I've made decisions that, support that I think it's going to happen. But it is possible for coercive organizations to create demand by artificially forcing people to use the asset. And in the case of state-owned money, that's what states do. You have to use pound sterling or US dollars or euros if you want to conduct business. If you don't, you go to prison. You can't get around it. And I think that one of the options for the future in terms of that is that there are states, like existing states like El Salvador, or new states that might emerge, or new free private cities that might emerge, where people take themselves entirely onto a Bitcoin standard, and those states end up outcompeting the other states. But at the same time, most of the world has this fiat monetary system, and in order to operate a business, you can get so far with using a kind of money that is not state sanctioned. But ultimately, if you're in a place where that is not allowed and the government has the monopoly on the use of force, then it becomes a kind of black market good. And so I think that's what Bitcoin is up against.
Right. Yeah. I mean, yeah, I mean, it's impossible to disagree with that. It exists because of coercion. The free market obviously would not choose it. And market actors within that system who have the latitude or flexibility or excess capital to make alternative choices to preserve or grow capital obviously do. And this is why we see, the monetary premium on so many assets and the hyper financialization that's occurring, because people don't want to use that. They use it to the extent that they must. And then, of course, there's this weird element that when you instantiate a system based on coercion like that, like how much does that influence the other behaviors of market actors, right? Once you put them in a position where one of their primary economic calculations is derived through coercion, how much does that kind of like zombify them into making into having perversions in other decisions permeate their life and those decisions, and we could broadly sum this up as like the fiat world and the fiat prefix that we place on so many things. Like, why is it that, we call fiat academia and fiat food and fiat money and fiat culture? And it's very much because of that coercive mechanism and all the downstream effects of that bleeding into those elements of the culture and perverting their natural function and perverting the preferences and the motivations and the incentives that exist downstream of that. And that's what we're trying to fix, right? Or that's what we're participating in, an alternative system that removes a lot of that. And which brings us, I guess, to what you were saying in 2020, where you wanted to make a career move. And so what's that been like? And I guess this is also partially leads into a question that I often ask, and one of the topics that I'm super interested in is how Bitcoin changes you, right? And so in your case, it sounds like, and man, I can totally relate to this, because when I was the latter years in China, for me, as much as I liked the lifestyle there, the work was just soul destroying. In fact, for most of my life in China, the work was pretty soul destroying. And I think a lot of people can relate to that, whether they're in China or America or Europe, because most work is kind of soul destroying, right? In an economy and in a culture that's been so perverted as ours has been through the base layer money, the things that emerge on top of that aren't necessarily coherent with the preferences and the desires and the motivations and the type of work that people would like to be doing. And there is this felt sense like, why do I feel so incongruent? Like, because, ostensibly, and I know this is very complex and I'm oversimplifying, but like the preferences that an individual feels should roughly match, the options that are available to them out in the world, right? If they truly are their preferences and their values, because those are the things that they would select in terms of deploying their capital towards, in terms of their spending and all that kind of stuff. And so there should be a better coherence, or like a high fidelity mirror between the individual and the culture. But I think we're finding in the world today is that a lot of people feel like that mirror is very muddy. It's not a very high fidelity mirror. People feel a certain way, and then they look out in the world and it doesn't line up very well at all. And I think, in my opinion, that is because of how the co-option of the monetary system has caused let's say the preferences of the people that most control that system to be over accentuated in the culture and in the economy, and the people that don't have control or influence of the monetary system, and therefore don't have that much control over directing the preferences that exist in the economy and the culture, their preferences are underrepresented as a result of that. And that creates this schism where people don't feel so don't feel so connected to the broader culture. So long-winded way of saying, like, I think a lot of us feel that soul-crushing aspect of our work, like, man, I don't want to be doing this. And then you come around to learning about Bitcoin and learning about Austrian economics, learning about all the different ways that Bitcoin rectifies these problems in the system. And then you start to develop a perception or, an imagery in your mind of a more hopeful future. And this is why, of course, we say Bitcoin is hope, right? You project out and you see something far more fair and far more in line with those elements of yourself that you want to express and that you want to amplify and that you want to share with the world. And this is, and then we see people making a decision like you've made, like I've made, like all these people that are trying to enter the Bitcoin space have made, and say, like, I want to contribute to that. That is, way more meaningful to me, and I get way more pleasure out of that. And sure, it doesn't help that if you bought Bitcoin a few years ago, or even in March 2020, that gives you a nice little foundation to actually be able to make that choice, to remove a bit of the financial security pressure that might be keeping you in that soul destroying job, and allow you to say, hey, I'm gonna roll the dice. I'm gonna take a risk and actually deploy my energy and capital into something that I believe more in. And so, how's that process been like for you since, I guess, making a choice like that in early 2020?
Yeah, that's very well put, John. And as you say, if you distort the monetary system, you end up distorting everything, because it's the way in which we send signals to each other about what we value. And the thing that really attracts me to Bitcoin is that by its nature, as a bearer instrument that can't be coercively inflated or can't be taken away by people without their consent, you limit these interactions in the economy to mutually beneficial voluntary transactions. No one can take your Bitcoin, so no one can force you to no one can use Bitcoin in order to engage in involuntary transactions that involve coercion. And I think one of the problems we have at the moment is because money is not only centrally controlled and created via government spending and by central banks, you have the kind of spending power and the time, human time that draws on, being distributed first from the government and the financial system, and then towards the end of the other parts of the economy. But at the same time, you end up, because people are forced to use this system, and because the system is highly regulated, like there are lots of activities that you can't engage in if you have a bank account, otherwise your bank account will get shut down. You force human interaction into this very artificial realm. And it means that a lot of people, because they need to make money, because they need to survive, they end up doing jobs that they don't find rewarding. And I'd say that's approximately the situation I found myself in. I didn't find the work particularly rewarding, but it was maybe a product of that system to a certain extent. Sure. So, yeah, do you want to come in there?
No, I'd love to hear once you made that choice, or, it sounds like you made that choice because it wasn't particularly rewarding, but, talk about making that choice and jumping off the deep end and saying like, I'm actually going to take a different path in life as a result of your conviction in this thing.
Yeah. Okay, sure. So as you say, being involved in Bitcoin and Bitcoin doing rather well was helpful in making the decision, to move on. It just meant that there was a kind of insurance policy. Like if this really goes wrong, that's still there as a way that something I can draw on if I can't pay the bills or whatever. So I took this sabbatical, 6 months off. I spent a bit of time in Russia. I spent a lot of time reading these Austrian economics books and reading like some Russian classics like Anna Karenina, like these like really deep books that you want to take time to read. I had this big list and I worked through it, and it was a really good few months, tinged by a bit of darkness with everything that was happening in the world, but it was a really good period of self-growth. And what I started doing is, because I was reading these books, I was taking part in Saifuddin Amus's online economics courses, and we were having these weekly discussions with other people that are interested in economics and Bitcoin. So I was getting to read all these interesting books as part of that. Like partly they were the books of guests that were appearing on his podcast. And I decided that rather than just like taking this all in myself, I would try and summarize it so I could share it with other people so that they could maybe be inspired to read some of these books as well. And also from a personal perspective, that process helped me to kind of solidify the arguments and the evidence presented in the books in a way that was more compartmentalized and easy to remember. So I started putting out these like summary Twitter threads of various books that I'd read. Like I put one out on The Sovereign Individual that you mentioned earlier. I put one out on When Money Dies by Adam Ferguson about the Weimar hyperinflation. And these threads started to get a bit of traction online. And the first approach I got from someone was from a guy called Ronnie Sturfler, who works for a Liechtenstein-based investment firm, a wealth management firm called Incrementum. And he said, I've seen some of your Twitter threads that you're doing, like we'd love to have some stuff like that for our company based on the content we're doing. Would you be interested in and also we use the Austrian School of Economics to inform our investment philosophy and our macroeconomic analysis. So this seems really relevant to what you're doing. So he got in touch with me and I started producing content for him and contributing to some of his reports that they do at the firm. And the reason that firm is really interesting to me is that as I was studying the Austrian economics stuff, like you obviously get introduced to a lot of gold bug stuff and stuff to do with how gold functioned historically as money. And at the same time, I was interested in Bitcoin. And this firm, Incrementum, have traditionally worked with people that are interested in precious metals, but they also have active funds where they trade Bitcoin, hold Bitcoin and gold in a mixed portfolio, and they produce analysis on Bitcoin as well. So they interested me in that they were bridging this more traditional, old world European precious metals investment community with Bitcoin. And so I was really excited to work with them. So that was the first touch point. And then from there, I ended up getting more work with free private cities. I ended up actually working for Sapedine. I still do that now. And I did a bit of work with Blockstream as well.
And what's it been like, man? Because, you know, again, I explore this idea or phenomenon of transformation in Bitcoin a lot, and how interacting with the asset itself, how understanding its many different elements causes a fairly profound transformation in people. And then, you know, one of the big moves is like when you actually can extricate yourself from the former system and you can actually begin contributing or working in that space itself. I mean, a lot of people report that it's quite the quality of life improvement, all those things taken together. So, you know, have you experienced something like that since making these decisions and, you know, ostensibly working in a capacity that that's more fulfilling and satisfying? And then of course the orange pill itself, you know, maybe changing you in other ways. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, definitely. It's really great to be working on stuff that you're passionate about and interested in. And I was interested in a lot of aspects of my old work, but I can't say that it was a passion. And Bitcoin and creating systems that are more aligned to what I would describe as good economic thinking is something that I am passionate about. Like, I do feel very strongly on an emotional level that there are lots of things going wrong in the world, and I feel like economics, properly understood, provides the answers to that. And it's upsetting in a way when I feel like the Overton window is just in completely the wrong place. Like in my country, the UK, the parties are arguing about, you know, whether it should be 45% government spending, like as a percentage of GDP, or 47%, and whether we should give the NHS an extra £6 billion or not, and whether we should increase minimum wage. And it's like, this is where the vast majority of people are. And when you start looking at things from an Austrian economics perspective, you understand that this whole system has grown up over time, and all of these problems that we observe in society, like the social problems we observe and the economic problems and some of the things that feel deeply unfair about the society, they're largely a product of the fact that we have over-intervened in the economy. And so I'm interested in things that can help us to move to a more free, voluntary, like you might call it libertarian sort of society. And to be actually working with people that are seeking to do that is really cool. And it has improved my mental well-being, and it has, you know, made me a lot of good friends. And I would, you know, if people are thinking about doing this kind of thing, I would say that it's totally possible. What surprised me was that I was able to move from traditional job to completely remote with 4 different clients that I was working with in 4 different countries within a period of about 3 months. And it was just so much easier than I would have thought it would have been. Yeah.
I mean, I think it's one of the kind of magic phenomena that occurs when you align yourself with one of the things that you find most deeply meaningful, and then you approach it with the utmost integrity, and then you do your best to express what your own unique perceptive filter is seeing in those things. You know, so in your case, it's, you know, Bitcoin and Austrian economics being that deeply meaningful thing, you as an individual trying to approach it with the utmost integrity. And then, you know, to use the example of the tweet threads, it's like, this is how I interpret what I've just read, and there's obviously you borrow, and it's not necessarily all original content, let's say, but you're performing a service, which is like, I'm distilling the main insights from this thing to the degree that I see them, and I'm putting them out there, and what do you know, people take notice, and then you're on someone's radar, and someone thinks that these ideas and this approach is useful, and it opens doors, and it's such a simple process. All you've done is really just said, like, I'm interested in this, here's what I'm interested about, and the world goes, hey, great, let's talk. And I've heard this story so many times, and it's so wonderful, because we have to, we refer to our fiat selves, right, pre-Bitcoin, and we had to do so many things that this is kind of what I was mentioning before, but we have to do so many things that maybe we disagree with, or that we're not passionate about, or that doesn't get us excited, or makes us feel artificial. That's one of the worst things, man. Like, for me, in previous jobs and careers, like, you would just do it and you'd be like, this isn't me. This is not genuinely who I am. And that's such a gross feeling, because if you're not acting, you kind of convince yourself, like, okay, well, like, it's not me, I'm kind of performing in this role, but like, that's what people do, and I'm still me behind the performance, and I'm still me when I really get to hang out with my close friends or whatever. But it's like, that's not really true. You are how you act. That's who you are. You are your actions. And you convince yourself that that's not the case. You convince yourself, like, oh, I'm more than this. I've got more potential than this, and I'm not really that way. It's just what I have to do to get by. But from the world's perspective, no, that's who you are. And it's such a relief, and it's such an amazing phenomenon to see, amongst all the crazy shit that's happening in the world, and all the flaws and complaints that we might levy at it, like, to see this thing emerge where people are actually able to be themselves and pursue what they believe to be meaningful, and to be, like, almost authentic to a fault, right? Which, in Bitcoin Twitter, you might see some of that manifestation sometimes, but that you can actually do that and be rewarded by doors opening and opportunities happening, and connecting with other like-minded individuals, and actually begin building or contributing to a system that allows more and more and more and more people to do that. So, like, as you say about the Overton window, like, yeah, it's still very much, people are in a different conceptual universe about what they think is, or what they place importance on in terms of the functioning of society and economics and culture. But we can't forget that, like, so many are being siphoned off and sucked into this orange coin vortex, and it's changing them, and it's changing their perception, and it's moving that window. And sometimes we get down and think it's not happening fast enough, but it's happening pretty damn fast on a historical scale. And that's what's super hopeful. And when people go through that vortex, they almost never go back. And so I think and the bigger that thing becomes, the more surface area it has to welcome in and accommodate different interests, right? Because if what we're dealing with here is money, well, it affects basically everything, and it affects individuals tremendously. And the more people that come in and express themselves authentically in it and through it, the more and more people that appeals to, so that Overton window, as much as it seems like it's still way focused on the wrong thing, it could be way sooner than we think that could shift, and people, it could be on the thing, moving more rapidly toward the thing that we think is a better focus for it to have, and for people to be looking through it on the more meaningful or important things, so yeah, no question there. But it's amazing how fast this actually is happening. We're in the eye of the storm, and we can be wanting to think we wish it could happen more quickly, but I think it's happening a lot faster than we often give it credit for.
Yeah, and I think the key there is that when you have an economy that is run on a Bitcoin standard or a sound money standard, the alignment between what people value and what you do for your job is much closer, because it's all the product of people saying, I demand this. This is something that I genuinely want. This is not something that I am kind of creating through forcing people into doing something. This is something that I'm demanding on the market. And I think a lot of the well-being stuff you're talking about there comes from knowing that we are genuinely contributing to society, that we are genuinely serving other people. And when you have a sound money system, the only way that you can make that money is by someone saying, hey, this is something that I want. Can you do it for me? And this is what I'm willing to give in return in monetary terms. And when we live in a distorted economy, like those signals aren't there. And that's one of the things that I see happening, like when you move away from the kind of government sort of fiat monetary system and towards like purely voluntary transactions, then yeah, people tend to be more fulfilled spiritually, as well as doing things that they find are actually serving other people.
Yeah. And it's just way more fun over here in the Bitcoin vortex, like that's part of the appeal too. Like, even if you don't latch on to the economics or the problems of the existing system, I think people are just going to look over increasingly at this group of people being like, man, they seem content and happy and they're having fun and secure. Like, I want a piece of that, and I'll learn about all the reasons why after I come in, but that certainly seems better than the world is burning, everything is horrible and fucked on fire sort of mentality that seems to be prevailing in a lot of people today. But back to your story and what you're an example of, and myself and many others, is how people are extricating themselves from this system and trying to make themselves minimally impacted by the oppressive nature of this system, and become, establishing remote work, being adaptable physically, monetarily speaking, having their assets outside of the far-reaching grasp of the state and things like that. So this is, I guess, the segue into the free private city stuff, because probably the biggest topic of conversation today in light of all the COVID stuff is, where do you, like, a transition is clearly happening. Where do you go to insulate yourself from what's happening? And will there be a balkanization? Will there be a breakdown of the size of nation states as a result of this move into the digital age or the information age? Because what you and I are doing, like, we are less appealing, or we are less lucrative tax entities as far as the state is concerned than someone who's living in London, working in London, with their bank account in London or in Toronto or New York. And this will inevitably cause fracturing and a less and less ability for these large behemoth industrial age systems of political organization to maintain themselves. And so you mix in a bunch of the pressures that a new economic system emerging will impose on that, and the breaking points of the existing economic, financial, and monetary system. And it stands to reason, I think a lot of people would reason, that you'll get a political fracturing. And so bring me to the current state of this free private cities ideas. And also I'd love to hear your thoughts on how you think this balkanization or this fracturing will occur, the timeline it'll occur, and maybe best practices and approaches to weather it.
Yeah. So I do think that the digital age is bringing about is giving more power to individuals, because they are able to work across multiple jurisdictions just by opening up their laptop and having an internet connection. And one of the things that James Dow Davison and William Rees-Mogg talk about in The Sovereign Individual is that the fact that in the Industrial Revolution, there was so much focus on physical infrastructure, factories developing, this centralized populations and made populations easier to control and allowed the state to kind of grow around that. And I do think now we're seeing a situation where the large companies that have the largest market cap and make the most money are operating either entirely or largely in the digital realm, and they have their kind of physical capital is much less important than their intellectual capital. And I think that's a really positive trend because it gives more power to individuals to resist tyranny and to pursue a kind of lifestyle that they desire, rather than a kind of lifestyle that is imposed on them by the system in which they live. So Free Private Cities Foundation is an organization that was founded by Titus Gabel, who's a German mining entrepreneur. And he wrote a book in 2018. So this isn't a particularly new concept, but it does draw on a lot of, much older libertarian ideas. And that book is titled Free Private Cities, Making Governments Compete for You. And the idea behind it is that governments require citizens in order to generate revenue. Right? That's how they survive. And if we live in a world where the citizens are able to move freely, which we have kind of become, and we've seen more of that sort of changing a bit with COVID, but we can come back to that. In that sort of system, governments are going to start to realize that actually you can't just impose top down what you want on your population and expect them still to be there. You're going to have to make your jurisdiction more attractive to people that are mobile. And what the Free Private Cities Foundation does is it tries to make the moral case for cities that operate autonomously, that try and make themselves attractive to remote workers and don't have this dynamic of a powerful ruler and a less powerful citizen, but they have a partnership of equals where there's not just this hypothetical social contract between the government and the citizen, but there's actually a real contract for services, in the same way that we have a contract for services that we might acquire in other areas of life, whether it's like our phone or internet service or whatever. We have services for things like getting your rubbish collected, or someone maintaining the streets for you, or maintaining the policing. And Free Private Cities is an alternative model for doing that, essentially. And the foundation is about promoting the concept, and there are also organizations that partner closely with the foundation that Titus is also involved in, that are seeking to actually invest in specific projects in different countries that align closely to this model. So there are a number of projects in Honduras that are doing some of the things that are related to this Free Private Cities model. There's also other projects in the pipeline which aren't announceable yet, but in other parts of the world. But the reason I got excited about this concept is because I read the book. The book is fantastic. If you haven't checked it out, I'd recommend giving it a read, because it really makes the strong moral case for autonomous cities that are based on mutual consent. And what I liked about this organization is that it wasn't just kind of complaining and saying, oh, we're libertarians, we know about Austrian economics, we know that this system doesn't work well, we can explain why it doesn't work well. They're kind of saying, right, enough talking, we're actually going to start building something. We're going to start building putting real investment into building new cities that align more closely to this model. And in 2018, it was just an idea. There are now 3 or 4 actual projects around the world that are in part aligned to this idea. And I find that really exciting, that in just a couple of years, we've actually got some real progress on the ground.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm familiar with some of them. I know in Honduras, the one on Roatan, Prospera, and then there's one inland. The thing, and I'm all for it, right? Experiment, hopefully there'll be thousands of these and the cream will rise to the top, and people will preferentially select the best ones and they will receive the best, rewards, and they'll proliferate, etc. The thing, and then I guess there's another way people are approaching this, because some of these things seem like they're trying to build like an OS for a free private city, and they're really trying to, put a lot of intentional work into these contracts and the laws and regulations of these places. And then, of course, there's another approach that some Bitcoiners are pursuing in light of, the current times, which is just to say, establish sovereignty as well as you can, right? Water source, let's say, independent of the electricity grid, food source, maybe you have some cattle on some land, that kind of thing. And that's the best way to ride out this transition while the nation state goes through its transformation or degradation, or however you want to call it. And I think the latter is probably a more adaptable approach, if for no other reason that it has less operating rules built into it, right? Whereas these other systems, maybe they kind of live or die by whether or not they've structured things properly, and the less structured one may benefit because of that. But my big question with all this is, because of, again, in the sovereign individual, they talk about the logic of violence. This is why things have kind of, and the economic systems that have prevailed as a result of technology, is why we get the political structure and size that we have gotten. So in the industrial age, we get these big, huge governments. People are not mobile. They're in factories. The tax base is immobile. And there's obviously rationale behind why these political systems emerge as they do. However, coming out of that, we're coming from a stage where governments are enormous, where they have basically absolute power, maybe the pinnacle of which is access to nuclear weapons, let's say. And how does the monopoly on violence change, work, is a consideration in this more distributed, balkanized, free private cities sort of emerging world that's happening now? What's your take on that particular aspect of all this?
Well, one of the key differentiating factors of the free private city is that no one is forced to go there, and also you can control who comes in, who comes out. You're in charge of that whole system. Now, a lot of people, they think about that as, oh, it's like a kind of walled enclave for the few, and it's going to be exclusive. But that doesn't make business sense. If you're a business, you want to try and encourage as many customers as possible to come and set up in your jurisdiction. And it's only people that are going to come and cause trouble and be violent or violate other people's rights that you're going to say aren't allowed to take part in that society. And I think that, as you say, the cities will live and die based on what their rules are. But the thing is, if there are a number of these things, a market develops. We call it the market for living together. And the states that come in and decide that they're going to try and audit everyone's lives, I just don't think there will be a market for them. People already have that. If they want to move to any Western democracy, there are already lots of rules about what you can and can't do, and the state plays a very big role in your life. So the existing projects that I would say are aligned to the free private cities idea, they all err on the side of very minimal intervention. In Prospera, they have to have income tax for the people, but they keep that as, in the ZAs in Honduras in general, they have to have income tax for people. That's part of the setup that they've got there. But they keep things like that very minimal, and they keep the regulations very minimal. They try and get architects to come in to build new things and say to them, if you could build anything you wanted, what would you build? Come up with a concept. So the experience to date, and I'll admit it is limited because it's quite a new concept, but it is real, it is there, has been that these developments are pursuing a more laissez-faire or more a less government heavy-handed model. And so I think that there is benefit for certain people to pursuing something within their own country. Like, I know that I'm always going to have ties to the UK, and I want to maintain ties to the UK because that's where my family are, that's where my friends are, that's where I grew up, that's where I'm kind of closer to the culture. I can integrate more easily into that culture. So I'm always going to have connections to the UK, but I'm not sure it's somewhere where I want to live all the time. And if there are places that are offering something that is much more aligned to my values, particularly when it comes to things like how future public health problems are going to be solved, then I can see that I would want to actually move away. And you can live a fairly independent lifestyle in certain countries, but if people impose curfews, you can't go outside without a vaccine passport, or you can't participate in normal life, then you are limited in the kind of life you can live. I mean, the kind of like, I really enjoyed your episode with Joel from Untapped Growth, and that's a great way of living for a lot of people. But you are limited in the economies of scale that can develop and in the economic cooperation you can have with everyone living in this kind of way. Like, I think cities are a good thing. They're part of the economy for a reason, and I think they would definitely exist in a free market because of the agglomeration benefits that come from living together. So I think what I'd say is that there would be a place for both of these, and I think that both options for people will become more popular as time goes on.
Yeah. So what do you think? Bitcoin obviously changes the ability of the state, the monopoly power, let's say, to extract tribute from people, right? It makes people's assets more difficult to harvest. How do you think that will change the structure of the governments that we see today? And in particular, how will it impact their ability to maintain the monopoly on violence and exact it, right? This is the thing I keep coming back to, because you could say, yeah, there's a distributed network of free private cities, and they're nestled within these larger states. But if something like what's currently happening with COVID come down, sure, the free private city is not going to coerce you, but maybe the monopoly power of the region, the US, China, whoever, who has influence on many things downstream, maybe they coerce the free private city, and then you're just back to square one. So in this emerging world, and this is the thing that I keep grappling with, I understand how Bitcoin changes the logic of violence, but in terms of how the transition goes from the monopoly, the institution, the government that has a monopoly on violence, and how it either permits or impedes the formation of these other models for living together, how does that play out in your mind?
I think the theoretical model with this, and we're talking about very profound changes, really, if we follow the economic logic of what will happen with Bitcoin. And with very profound changes, you have to be cautious about like the probability you assign to them happening. But I think if Bitcoin continues to function as it has done for the past 10 years, in that no one has been able to, carry out a successful attack on the network, or no one has found a way of revealing everyone's private keys, like the technological side of it has proved to be incredibly sound and reliable, I would expect more and more people to start using it as a savings technology. We're seeing that's already happening to a huge degree, and you would see more and more people start to take advantage of its network, of its monetary network properties. I mean, the stuff that Jack Mallers is doing at Strike is really phenomenal in terms of just using the Lightning Network to transform the entire kind of global remittance industry. I think that more and more people will just move towards this, and there's a market for money, and it's a kind of zero-sum market in a way. And the larger Bitcoin grows, the more it takes market share from traditional stores of value and means of exchange, and those are other currencies. So you would just expect there to be higher inflation, and you would expect governments that have draconian, like legacy fiat monetary policies, to just become less attractive, and the power to gradually move towards the Bitcoin-based economies. And you can say something like that and not put a timeline on it, and it's quite easy to do. I think the question in my mind is how long does it take? I feel like things are already moving in that direction, and Bitcoin is already growing incredibly quickly. But we're up against a lot. We're up against Bitcoin is barely on a lot of people's radars. And I think that there are lots of very mainstream narratives about things like climate change, about social justice, and people feeling very strongly that the government should be able to redistribute wealth in the way that it desires. There's a lot of people that, for them, Bitcoin is perhaps just about on their radar, but once it gets bigger and bigger, there will be a lot of people that are trying to disrupt it. And what I don't know is how that is going to play out. I suspect it's going to be extremely difficult. But Bitcoin is incredibly robust, and the economic arguments are on its side in the long term. And that's why I've decided to work in it, and that's why I encourage other people to use it as a way of achieving monetary sovereignty.
Yeah. Yeah, I largely agree with that. And it's interesting to think of, let's say the circular economy of Bitcoin and the people who have adopted it as a unit of account. It's in one stage right now, but what does the power and influence of that network look like when we 10x from here, when we're at $600,000 Bitcoin rather than 60? I mean, that's a pretty big jump in influence and power. And then what about 100x, and the efficiency of capital and the generation of wealth in that network is going to so outcompete that happening in those legacy monetary systems that, that network will definitely accrue more and more power, wealth, and influence. And I would think that's a good thing. I guess, what's on all our minds is how does that transition look? And in the sovereign individual, we may look out on the world today, and you reference what's happening currently with COVID, and it's like, oh well, black swan event. It's like, well, maybe not. Maybe the reason why the approach has been as it has been, and let's say consciously from a certain cohort of people, mostly subconsciously from a larger cohort of people in positions of power and influence, that this sort of overbearing response is a direct manifestation of the increasing ineptitude, incompetence, irrelevance of that massive centralized authority that is state power, attempting to maintain its grasp on control. This is certainly how they frame it and articulate it in the sovereign individual. And I think it's a more useful framework for understanding what's happening today, because otherwise, you might just think, oh, it's just coincidence and things will go back to normal. But if you frame it in terms of, monetary system unwinding, the political structure no longer being relevant or fit for the technological circumstance that predominates, well, then it makes a lot more sense to interpret it as even if you don't want to attribute malice, a subconscious response to that disintegration of power. That using an event like this is a way to consolidate control. However, if that is the case, it kind of begs the question: well, how does that end? What does it morph and change into? I'm sure you've given that some thought. I'd love to hear it.
Yeah, that is a really interesting part of the book, isn't it? Where they talk about nation states eventually shutting down international flights, because this is a way of kind of keeping the population pegged in. And really that in the context of COVID is pretty interesting and seems very prescient. I'm honestly not convinced that that's actually what's going through the minds of people that are in governments. I don't think they really realize what's happening in the way that James Dale Davison and William Rees-Mogg do. I think they genuinely believe what they say most of the time, in terms of believing that government acting in the way it does is the right thing. And they get a lot of power and prestige from being that way. And it's easier to convince yourself of a self-serving narrative. But the reality is what it is. The reality won't change. And I hear like the UK Chancellor Rishi Sunak talking about, we're going to increase this funding for the NHS and we're going to fund it through extra national insurance contributions, and we're going to put an extra tax on this. And all their models assume population stays where it is or grows at the previous rate, and that people maintain the same income and you just take more of their income. And the world doesn't work like that. The world, people respond to incentives, and economics is a product of human action. It's not a product of statistical aggregates that are kind of cooked up in by university economists. It's a product of people's real choices. Mm-hmm. And I think people will move, will start moving to places that are freer. But as I say, that there do need to be those places that really do exist. And this is why I think that free private cities is a good kind of complement to people that are seeking more autonomy within the existing nation state.
Yeah, I think in the book, I don't think they attribute conscious agency to the response by states to like close down the borders, for example. Let's take the comments by Yellen recently, the unrealized capital gains thing, which is complete insanity. But I don't see that as them sitting around the table being like, oh, the information age and people are distributing, they're more easy to hide wealth. And like, we really need to stop that or reverse that trend. I think it's just like the state has become so big and bloated. All they see the bottom line. They're like, we need more money to keep doing what we're doing. Well, how do we get more money? Well, tax this and control that and tax this. And so I agree with you that they don't see the big, broad picture and they're trying to respond in kind. I see it them just trying to manage a system that is no longer fit for the technological paradigm that we're in and the ways in which people are responding to it. And they're trying to hold on for dear life to their power and to their influence. And it's manifested in all these absurd things that are being discussed and imposed now. Which I don't know if that's better or worse, because at least if people were conscious of it, if you could change their mind, they could do differently. But if they're just kind of so embedded in a system and an ideology, then their efforts to maintain that are the very efforts that will not only sow the seeds of its own destruction, but will cause greater and greater misery for the people that they're trying to impose that on. And again, I think we see that, predominate at the current time. Curious to ask you, how have the existing free private city projects responded to the COVID situation? Have they had the latitude to resist lockdowns, masks, mandates of various kinds, or have they fallen in line?
So the existing projects have, I think, tended to err on the side of caution with this in terms of doing what most societies have done. And I'm not running one of the cities. The problem that you have is if you are a development that is very new and is trying to set something up that is pretty game-changing, then it's very easy for someone to come along when that's at an early stage and say, no, this is some crazy radical experiment. We're going to shut it down because look, like we've got a COVID crisis and these people aren't wearing masks and these are radical people. We need to send the military in. And so I can understand why you might want to go more in line with what other states have done. There haven't been these kind of lockdowns in some of these places, but I feel like it's not a radical diversion from the existing policies. What you might expect is if more of these states develop and they get larger, they turn into places like, more like city states like Hong Kong or Singapore, that they might pursue a different policy because they have more power. Like someone told me the other day that Singapore has more tanks than the German army at the moment or something because of their economic power. Like as states get stronger, they are able to draw more economic resources and defend themselves better, and it becomes harder for them to resist pressure from outside. So what I would stress about existing projects And as I say, there are a number of projects out there that are kind of like partly aligned to the principles. In other ways, they diverge. But there is a very kind of realpolitik consideration regarding what they do at an early stage in their development.
Right. I can appreciate that. But to your knowledge, what things were imposed in these places? Do you know? Like, are you talking mask mandates were, or vax mandates, or whatever? Like you said, there was no lockdowns.
So I don't really want to say too much on it, to be honest, John, because I think
I'm getting the sense that they weren't so free.
Well, no, actually, I don't think there were strict impositions on people, but I think things like people were encouraged to wear masks and things like that. I think that those sorts of things were encouraged. But you know, as I say, I haven't been to these places yet myself and visited, so sure. It's hard to know exactly what's going on the ground in terms of that. But you know, I think that with COVID, you're in a slightly difficult situation. There's a lot of pressure on people to do certain things, and you know, you have to act in a way that you think is going to be prudent in terms of your, you know, long-term ability to grow. Yeah,
and this is the often ugly process of trying to match solutions with reality and figuring out how to do so, you know, and this comes to me, it comes back down to the issue of force, right? Like, you could characterize freedom as the ability to say no, right? Nobody can impose anything on you if you don't want to do what they're suggesting or trying to impose. What is the defense model? And I understand that the existing free private cities are kind of nestled within existing jurisdictions, and they probably have some sort of protection agreement with them of some kind. But what do you see as the role of defense in the future of these private jurisdictions?
I would say that would be probably the primary role that the city operator would play in the cities. It would be to protect property rights, because that's how, you know, economies can only function well if people have property rights and they are protected in some way. And so I would see that as, like, you've got a problem. So let's take Honduras as an example. Honduras is quite a dangerous country to be in by global standards. It's got something like the third highest homicide rate in the world, and business isn't good there because people can't, if they invest capital, they can't guarantee the security of that capital. People are less likely to move there because they're worried about their personal safety. And what a free private city model, or what the ZA model offers as one of its key features, is security on the ground. And that's a big feature. So people that go and move to a ZA, take Morazan, for example, they have a very big focus on providing security to the local population that work there. And they are really inundated with applications of local people that want to live there, because they know that if they go and work there, they can have a safe life for themselves. And it's not about, for them, like, oh, I can smoke weed, or I can do something that's like libertarian that's not allowed in normal society. It's like, I've got the protection of my life, liberty, and property in this place, and I just want to have a normal family life, and I want to be able to make some money and save some money and create a better future for my family. So that's already, I would say, in the ZA model, something that is really important. They have like military. The military agreement there is with the host government. So there is a certain percentage of profits that are paid to the host government of Honduras to protect them militarily from like outside attack. And I think that would be a likely future model. It's kind of how Hong Kong and China work as well, right? Like, you've got, it's when it was handed back to China in 1997, it's basically one country, two systems. You've got internal autonomy, but you're part of China nominally, and also the military situation is overseen by China. You might get similar situations like that evolving.
let's explore this for a second, because it's something I'm really curious about, and the obvious answer may not be the most likely, and we're just speculating because we don't know. But let's assume that because Bitcoin exists, and that's the most concentrated form of capital, right? Money.
Yeah.
So let's say that that is, because that's so inaccessible, it does dramatically change the logic of violence, right? So let's say you get less armies crossing borders on horseback to steal the gold supply of their adversary, right? We get less of that because there's a far less incentive. But let's assume that there's two competing private cities that are in close proximity to one another, and one's economic model just way outperforms the other, let's say. And so one is growing faster and one has a geographic imperative of some kind. And let's say, this one says, okay, well, we could do more with that geography and we want it. Again, less of a magnetic pull because there's not so much to be derived from forcefully taking over another person's jurisdiction. But I don't think we can say that that impulse is eliminated entirely. And so, because force will still exist, violence will still be a factor, and let's say land and productive capacity is scarce, even if we enter into a more abundant world and a more digital world, which ostensibly might introduce an element of kind of like infinite abundance in a certain domain of our lives and in how we create wealth and value. So, because right now, armies determine borders basically and preserve borders. And how do you think the distribution of land ownership on which these private jurisdictions are built mingles with the benefits of violence in the future?
Yeah, really good question. So you're right, you're never going to eliminate aggression and violence in the world. The question is, how do you minimize it? And with the free private cities model, there is a contract between the city operator and the citizen that they sign. And it outlines what will lie within the city operator's responsibility. So for example, the city operator will keep the streets safe. And if you're mugged on the streets, the city operator will seek the perpetrator or compensate you monetarily or whatever it is. Each city could have its own individual contract. But there's not a process whereby the only way that an invasion could happen like that is if that was somehow in the contract, that invasions were allowed of other kinds of cities, and people would have to make a decision as to whether they were going to move to that sort of city or not. So that would be within the contract. And the way that the contract works is that you would have third-party arbitrating courts that would oversee any disputes between the operator and the citizen, much like the way that works in international business law at the moment, where you have countries, you have third-party country courts that might adjudicate a particular dispute between international businesses. And if you have businesses that are operating like companies and they say, we're just going to ignore the verdict of this court and we're just going to do what we want, we're going to just operate like a pariah, then that again is not a very attractive investment proposition. I don't want to live in a country that's going to start invading people, because people don't just sit back when they get invaded, they invade back. And it's also very costly to fund a military expedition. It's not like, oh, I've got the military, let's just send them over there, take their stuff, and we've got all their wealth plus ours. It's like, no, you've got to pay for that expedition. You've got to pay for all of the reputational costs that brings about. You've got to pay for extra security for all of the people that will be hostile towards your state. And so you're never going to eliminate the violence, but I do think this model minimizes it. And we can see throughout history that where you have had small states emerge, there have been long periods where states, take Liechtenstein, take Monaco, take San Marino, these states have all got very large neighbors who are very much more powerful than them. But those states haven't invaded, the larger states haven't invaded the smaller states.
Hmm.
in part because they recognize that it's good to trade peacefully and they benefit from peaceful trade economically with their neighbors. So I would like to see that dynamic playing out more broadly in the world. And I think that having power that is less centralized, where people have more direct connection to those that are operating the infrastructure around them, and there's less of this centralization of power, I think in that kind of world, we will have more peace and we will have fewer problems with aggression from between states.
Yeah, I'm inclined to agree. And I guess it could also be the case. I mean, when everyone, you talk about that unifying, states might, or free private cities or whatever, might engage in conflict dependent upon like how their kind of primary ordering mechanism diverges or how their incentives diverge. And if everyone's on the same monetary unit, that's already a massive leg up in creating cohesiveness. But I guess it could also be the case that in this hyper-connected world where information travels at the speed of light, the most beneficial way to structure a given city or an economy will probably be very obvious and known, right? The disparity that one creates versus another will be very clear, and most economic actors will probably adopt the dominant form or the best form of organization. And in that case, you made me think of this because you were talking about the cost of just, sending the army out to do whatever. If you assume that the asymmetry of wealth and power between roughly equal states is like very minor, and then you also add into that mix that the benefit of, having the army cross the border is only the relatively long-term capital of, let's say, the land and not the immediate capital of the gold, i.e. the Bitcoin, then maybe it just doesn't make really any economic sense, because the cost of the big cost of sending that army across for the relatively non-immediate and small payoff, maybe it just completely changes that dynamic. And like, it only works if you get a big payoff up front, i.e. the concentrated wealth that has historically been gold.
Yeah.
If that's no longer the case, then it's like, this doesn't even make economic sense. We're shooting ourselves in the foot here. And, another interesting element that seems to be emerging, a trend that seems to be emerging to influence all this stuff, is like, it seems like people will increasingly become self-contained, self-contained economies. Not that they won't interact and trade, but, if you're generating your own power, and if you're generating your own food, and if you're growing your own vegetables, if you're, doing all these things that technology is now allowing us to do, I wonder, seemingly that might even push the value of just geography and land down even further, because there's not as much of an imperative to acquire new land to grow food for your growing population if every new unit of the population is more independent, and more self-contained in a sense. So maybe that changes the logic as well. It's super interesting, man. I mean, we live in just insane times, like in terms of change, and the next 10, 20 years, I think we're going to see a ton of this, which again, I think is the cause for also anxiety. There's a tremendous amount of hope, but there's a tremendous amount of anxiety, because we're emerging from a really dark sort of system and potentially moving into its darkest days, and trying to build something better as we come out of it. What are your steps now, do you think, in terms of these private cities, in terms of people establishing citadels? I'm sure you thought about it a ton. Like, we've talked a bit about being adaptable and being remote, but what are you personally focused on establishing for this transition that we've kind of been exploring?
Well, I'm hoping that we can encourage more projects to develop, because I think the larger the market is for these projects, and the more of them there are in a particular area, the more normalized they become and the more difficult they are to crush at an early stage. So my efforts are focused on spreading the word about doing governance differently. And I'm hoping to visit some of these ZAs in the next few months. And I'm hoping to go to some additional countries where we might see new projects. And I'm personally trying to keep myself in a flexible situation where I can respond if there's going to be, for example, another lockdown, and I can move to somewhere else, and I don't have to feel tied to a particular place because of my job. And Bitcoin is obviously another part of that. As time goes on, I'll be looking to Bitcoinize more and more of what I do, and I think that's a really important way of giving yourself the ability to respond to what's coming, because I think none of us really saw something quite as extreme as what happened in 2020 happening. And I don't know what the future is going to be. There's lots of different things that could happen. And I think you just have to kind of make sure that you've got savings, you've got flexibility, that you're not putting your eggs in these more like traditional baskets, if you like, regarding like what the old system is. So that's roughly what I'm trying to do.
Right.
How about yourself, John?
Very similar. I mean, I am, concerned about the way things are going, and it seems to, unless you have, your cabin in the woods citadel already with your own water and food and all that kind of stuff, and you can hunker down, if you're still going to be out in the world to some degree, I can't see any other, I can't see a better approach than just being as adaptable as possible and having the vast majority, if not all of your wealth in a money that you can take with you that nobody can touch, i.e. Bitcoin. And, if your income is not geographically determined and your savings are in Bitcoin, then at least you're ahead of most people. And you can, I'm sure we've all heard this joke, but like, if you're being chased by a wolf or a bear in the forest, right, you don't have to be the fastest, you just have to be faster than the slowest. I kind of hate to use that because it means somebody's going to get fucked, but being adaptable and being able to play that jurisdictional arbitrage game seems like the name of the game. And hopefully there's enough desire for freedom, autonomy, individual choice in the world that jurisdictions will kind of keep the light of freedom alive. Because one of the elements of this whole COVID situation that's been concerning is that so few have chosen to do that. And the populations in these countries are so, in my opinion, hysterical and kind of brainwashed by the state apparatus and state propaganda and that Overton window that you were talking about before, that they willingly and with almost no resistance go along with so many of these things that I think probably to you and I and many people listening are almost unthinkably egregious infringements on, rights and freedoms and, that kind of stuff. So the jurisdictional arbitrage game only works if some people are offering different things in these different jurisdictions. And right now, like, it seems like that may be the case. And hopefully as the economic capacity of this network grows and grows, the incentives to accommodate them, as we've been discussing, will grow along with that. And jurisdictions will make that calculation and say, well, do I want to piss off the US, the IMF, the WHO, whoever they're beholden to, or do I want to attract several $1 billion in capital from this cohort of people that's demanding these sorts of regulations and services and that kind of stuff. So I'm hopeful, and the best way to take advantage of that is to do what you're doing, which is be adaptable, work on the things that are most meaningful, stack as much Bitcoin as you possibly can, because those are the keys to the kingdom, I guess.
Yeah.
Peter, have we not touched on anything that you wanted to explore today?
Well, just to say as well that I think, coming back to what you were saying about these being the fastest one, running away from the bear, it is important that we make people understand that Bitcoin is not just about getting really wealthy and Bitcoin going to the moon and it's going to save us because we're going to have so much savings. Like, I think this is something you do really well on your podcast. You make the moral, ethical case that if we have a sound money standard, it's not something that is for the privileged few, it's for everyone in society. And when you have a society that's based on peaceful interaction only, that's good for everyone. And that brings up the people that are kind of at the bottom of the socioeconomic ladder as well. And that's what really excites me about Bitcoin. And I want to emphasize that. And I want to say thanks for doing all the good work you do on the podcast, because I think you're a very, very thoughtful person about the ethics behind Bitcoin. And that's a message that we really need to be getting out there.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I think this goes back to the comparison between the fiat world and a money that's instantiated based on coercion and one that's completely voluntary. And what are the principles that underlie those two options? And I think what's happening with Bitcoin is, and I talk about some of the more esoteric elements of this quite often, but it's almost like an alchemical notion that the principles in the thing that you engage with and that is kind of so high up on your value hierarchy ends up being transmuted into you, right? So these principles of openness and fairness and honesty and truth and connectedness and unity and all the other things that you might ascribe to Bitcoin, they start to permeate the mindset of people. That seems to be what I'm observing, at least. And I think that's a really good thing. I think those are really great principles, and the more people interact with them and integrate them, I think the more hope we have for humanity, I guess we'll put it that way. So, but man, I appreciate you making the time today. I appreciate the work you're doing. I really hope that more options emerge in the various approaches to new organization and new economies. And, I think it's super cool, the work that you guys are doing at the Free Private Cities. So maybe in a year or so, we'll touch base again and see where things are at, if there's more jurisdictions that are popping up and more options for people, because, that's what we really need right now.
Yeah, I really hope the same, John. I think it's just about giving people more options. Like, no one's going to force you to go and live in a new city that emerges or have a different governance model. But there are lots of people that want to have a different option, an option to be freer, to do things differently, and to build society in a different way. And so I'm also hopeful that we'll be making some good progress. And I'd love to talk to you again. Let's do that again in the future. And it's been really good to talk to you today. Thanks.
Awesome. Well, as we like to say, freedom go up. And so I'm certainly hoping we see more of that. And appreciate it, brother. We'll talk again soon.
Great.